August 26, 1914. The morning mist clung to the forests of East Prussia as General Alexander Samsonov stood outside his command post near the town of Tannenberg, studying maps that no longer reflected reality. The 54-year-old commander of the Russian Second Army believed he was pursuing a retreating enemy. He had no way of knowing that at that very moment German forces were closing around him like a vice, preparing to execute one of the most devastating encirclements in military history. Within 4 days, his army of over 150,000 men would cease to exist. Samsonov himself would walk into a dark forest and put a bullet through his own head. This is the story of how the Battle of Tannenberg crushed an entire Russian army, and how one catastrophic defeat would echo through the remainder of the First World War and shape the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. The seeds of disaster were planted months before the first shot was fired. Germany had entered the war bound by the Schlieffen Plan, a strategic blueprint that had consumed German military thinking for over a decade. The plan was brutally simple in concept. Germany faced potential enemies on 2 fronts, France to the west and Russia to the east. Rather than divide forces equally, the Schlieffen Plan called for throwing everything against France first, delivering a knockout blow in 6 weeks, then racing those victorious armies eastward by rail to deal with Russia. The architects of this strategy had made a critical assumption that Russia's vast distances and primitive infrastructure would require months to mobilize its armies. While German troops swept through France, Russian forces would still be assembling, posing no immediate threat. This meant East Prussia, that vulnerable projection of German territory jutting into the Russian Empire, would be defended by only a skeleton force, the Eighth Army, comprising barely 10% of Germany's military strength. It was a calculated risk that depended entirely on Russian incompetence and German speed. But in August 1914, something unexpected happened. Russia mobilized faster than anyone had thought possible. The Russian High Command, knowing full well what the Schlieffen Plan entailed, had secretly begun mobilization as early as July 25th, days before war was even declared. When Germany officially declared war on August 1st, Russian armies were already assembling along the border. By August 7th, not 1 but 2 Russian armies were crashing into East Prussia from different directions. This was the nightmare scenario German planners had never seriously entertained, a massive Russian offensive before France had been defeated, before the main German armies could be redeployed, while East Prussia stood defended by only a fraction of Germany's strength. The invasion sent shockwaves through Berlin. Refugees flooded westward with stories of Cossack atrocities. German civilians watched their homes burn as Russian cavalry ranged deep into German territory. The political pressure on the German High Command became unbearable. The Kaiser himself demanded action. The Eighth Army, outnumbered and outgunned, faced annihilation. The Russian plan was straightforward and on paper devastating. 2 massive armies would advance into East Prussia from different directions, creating a classic pincer movement. The First Army under General Pavel Rennenkampf would strike from the northeast, advancing toward the fortress city of Königsberg. The Second Army under General Alexander Samsonov would drive north from the south, pushing toward the town of Allenstein. The 2 armies would converge like the jaws of a trap, crushing the German Eighth Army between them. If successful, the invasion would not only clear East Prussia of German forces, but could potentially threaten Berlin itself, forcing Germany to abandon the Schlieffen Plan and rush troops eastward, relieving pressure on France. For the Russians, it was an opportunity to win the war in its opening weeks. The mathematics seemed to favour them overwhelmingly. Rennenkampf commanded approximately 200,000 men. Samsonov had over 150,000. Together they outnumbered the German defenders by more than 2 to 1. Victory appeared inevitable, but the Russian plan contained fatal flaws that would only become apparent when blood began to flow. First, the 2 armies were separated by the Masurian Lakes, a vast network of waterways and marshland that made lateral communication nearly impossible. Rennenkampf and Samsonov would be fighting what amounted to separate battles, unable to coordinate effectively or support each other. Second, Russian logistics were a catastrophe waiting to happen. The armies had advanced so quickly that they had outrun their supply lines. Soldiers marched hungry, horses went without fodder, and artillery batteries rationed shells. The Russian rail system, inferior to Germany's in the best of times, simply could not keep pace with the advance. Third, and most critically, Russian communications were primitive and insecure. The armies lacked sufficient telegraph equipment, trained operators, and most incredibly, encryption systems. Russian commanders transmitted orders in the clear, in plain language, assuming German intelligence could not possibly intercept messages sent from deep within their own territory. This assumption would prove catastrophic. The human element made everything worse. Generals Rennenkampf and Samsonov despised each other with a passion that bordered on pathological. The two men had quarrelled violently during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, when Samsonov had publicly accused Rennenkampf of cowardice for failing to support him during a critical battle. Witnesses reported that the confrontation on a railway platform had nearly come to blows. In the years since, the two commanders had refused to speak to each other. Now they were expected to coordinate two armies in a complex military operation where timing and cooperation were everything. The Russian High Command either didn't know about the feud or didn't care. The result was two generals commanding separate armies who would rather see each other fail than cooperate to achieve victory. This personal animosity, combined with the physical separation imposed by the Masurian lakes and the lack of secure communications, meant the two Russian armies were effectively operating in complete isolation from each other. On August 20th, Rennenkampf's First Army clashed with German forces at the town of Gumbinnen in what would be the first major battle of the Eastern Front. The engagement was a confused, brutal affair that ended inconclusively, but the Germans withdrew afterward, which Rennenkampf interpreted as a victory. He immediately halted his advance to reorganize his forces, rest his exhausted men, and consolidate his supply lines. It was a reasonable military decision, but one that would have catastrophic consequences. Rennenkampf did not inform Samsonov that he was stopping. Samsonov, still advancing from the south, had no idea that the northern jaw of the pincer had stopped moving. He continued marching north, pushing deeper into East Prussia, believing that Rennenkampf was also advancing and that the two armies would soon link up. In reality, with every mile Samsonov advanced, the gap between the two Russian armies grew wider. The German Eighth Army, meanwhile, was in crisis. Its commander, General Maximilian von Prittwitz, was a corpulent 66-year-old officer whose nerve had failed completely. After the Battle of Gumbinnen, faced with Russian armies approaching from two directions, Prittwitz panicked. On August 20th, he telephoned the German High Command and announced his intention to abandon East Prussia entirely, retreating behind the Vistula River and conceding German territory to the Russians without a fight. The proposal was military madness and political suicide. The German High Command immediately relieved Prittwitz of command. But who would replace him? The man chosen was Paul von Hindenburg, a retired general of Prussian nobility who had been living quietly in Hanover. At 66 years old, Hindenburg had been out of active service for 4 years. His uniform no longer fit properly. His wife had to make hasty alterations before he could depart. But Hindenburg possessed qualities that Prittwitz lacked: steady nerves, unshakable calm, and the kind of stolid presence that inspired confidence in subordinates. He was not, however, a military genius. That role would fall to his newly appointed chief of staff. Erich Ludendorff was everything Hindenburg was not. Where Hindenburg was aristocratic, Ludendorff was a commoner who had clawed his way up through merit alone. Where Hindenburg was placid and calm, Ludendorff was driven, ambitious, prone to nervous energy that sometimes bordered on panic. At 49 years old, Ludendorff had just achieved fame by leading the German assault on the Belgian fortress of Liege, a daring action that had earned him Germany's highest military decoration. Now he was being rushed to East Prussia to serve as Hindenburg's chief of staff. The two men met for the first time on a railway platform in Hanover in the early morning hours of August 23rd. They shook hands, introduced themselves, and climbed aboard a special train heading east. They were an odd couple, the stolid aristocrat and the intense commoner, but their partnership would become legendary. During that train ride, Ludendorff studied the situation in East Prussia and began issuing orders even before arriving at 8th Army headquarters. What neither man knew was that the plan they would implement, the strategy that would bring them both fame and glory, had already been conceived by someone else entirely. Colonel Max Hoffmann was Prittwitz's deputy chief of operations, a brilliant, somewhat impish officer who combined strategic genius with an encyclopedic knowledge of the Russian army. Hoffmann had served as a military observer during the Russo-Japanese War, where he had witnessed Russian incompetence firsthand. More importantly, he had been present at that railway platform confrontation between Samsonov and Rennenkampf. He knew these men personally, understood their mutual hatred, and recognized what that meant for Russian military operations. When Prittwitz had proposed retreat, Hoffmann had argued vehemently against it. He had seen an opportunity, a chance not merely to defend East Prussia, but to destroy an entire Russian army. The plan Hoffmann proposed was audacious to the point of recklessness. He argued that the two Russian armies were too far apart to support each other, and that the personal animosity between their commanders would prevent effective coordination. Therefore, the Germans could safely ignore Rennenkampf's First Army in the north and concentrate everything against Samsonov's Second Army in the south, leave only a cavalry screen to watch Rennenkampf, move the bulk of Eighth Army by rail to the south, hit Samsonov with everything, smash through his flanks, encircle him, destroy him completely, then, and only then, turn north to deal with Rennenkampf. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. If Rennenkampf discovered what the Germans were doing and advanced aggressively, he could march unopposed to the Vistula, sever German supply lines, and trap the Eighth Army against Samsonov's forces. But Hoffmann bet that Rennenkampf wouldn't move, that his natural caution, his exhaustion, his supply problems, and perhaps his secret satisfaction at seeing Samsonov twist in the wind would keep the First Army stationary. When Hindenburg and Ludendorff arrived in East Prussia, they found Hoffmann's plan already in motion. German rail transport was a marvel of efficiency. Trains were moving entire corps across East Prussia with clockwork precision. The Germans could redeploy forces in days that would take the Russians weeks. Hindenburg and Ludendorff studied Hoffmann's proposal, recognized its brilliance, and adopted it as their own. Years later, Hoffmann would give sardonic tours of the battlefield, pointing out the various locations where Field Marshal Hindenburg had slept, before the battle, after the battle, and most pointedly, during the battle. But in August 1914, Hoffmann was content to watch his plan unfold. The key to everything was intelligence, and here the Russians handed the Germans an unbelievable gift. Russian radio operators, lacking encryption equipment and assuming their transmissions were secure, deep in Russian-occupied territory, sent messages in the clear. German listening posts intercepted everything. On the evening of August 25th, Hoffmann received two intercepts that confirmed his wildest hopes. The first was from Rennenkampf, detailing his First Army's intentions. He would continue resting, reorganizing, and then advance due west, not south towards Samsonov. The message made clear that Rennenkampf had no intention of supporting the Second Army. The second intercept came from Samsonov himself. Having encountered German resistance from the 20th Corps, which had been fighting a delaying action, Samsonov had interpreted the German withdrawal as a general retreat. His message outlined his plan to pursue northwest, believing he was chasing defeated enemies toward the town of Tannenberg. Hoffmann was elated. The Russians were doing exactly what he had hoped. Samsonov was advancing deeper into the trap while Rennenkampf sat motionless. When Hoffmann showed the intercepts to Ludendorff and Hindenburg, they were initially skeptical. What commander would be foolish enough to transmit operational orders without encryption? It had to be a deception. But Hoffmann convinced them the messages were genuine. The Germans would proceed with the encirclement. The plan called for a classic double envelopment, the same tactic Hannibal had used to destroy the Romans at Cannae 2,000 years earlier. German forces would strike both of Samsonov's flanks simultaneously, curl around behind him, link up in his rear, and trap the entire Second Army in a pocket. To accomplish this, General Hermann von Francois's First Corps would attack Samsonov's left flank from the west. General August von Mackensen's 17th Corps would hit the right flank from the east. In the centre, German forces would hold, absorbing Russian attacks but preventing breakthrough. If everything worked, the Russian Second Army would find itself surrounded, cut off from retreat, and destroyed piecemeal by German artillery and infantry. On paper, the plan was elegant. In execution, it nearly fell apart before it began. Francois was a problem. The general was a talented, aggressive commander, but he was also insubordinate and prone to ignoring orders he disagreed with. When Ludendorff ordered Francois to attack on August 25th, Francois refused. His artillery wasn't in position yet, he claimed. His ammunition supply was insufficient. He would attack when ready, not before. Ludendorff was apoplectic. The entire plan depended on simultaneous attacks from both flanks. If Francois delayed, Samsonov might realize the danger and escape. Ludendorff and Hoffmann personally drove to Francois's headquarters to deliver the order face to face. Francois reluctantly agreed to attack but continued to complain about ammunition shortages. The attack finally began on August 27th, 2 days behind schedule. Those 2 days proved critical, not because they allowed Samsonov to escape, but because they gave him time to advance even deeper into the pocket. By the time Francois struck, Samsonov had pushed his central corps forward aggressively, creating a pronounced bulge in his line that made encirclement easier. On the morning of August 27th, Francois's artillery opened fire on the Russian First Corps holding Samsonov's left flank. The barrage was devastating. German guns, precisely registered and well supplied despite Francois's complaints, tore through Russian positions. The Russian First Corps, exhausted from days of marching, short of supplies, and poorly positioned, began to crumble. By nightfall, Francois's infantry had broken through, and Russian forces were retreating in disorder. On the opposite flank, Mackensen's 17th Corps struck the Russian 6th Corps with equal ferocity. The 6th Corps, already weakened by earlier fighting, collapsed almost immediately. 2 divisions fled northward in panic. By the evening of August 27th, both of Samsonov's flanks were caving in, but Samsonov, positioned with his central corps, had no clear picture of what was happening on his flanks. Russian communications had broken down completely. Messengers took hours to traverse the distances involved, if they arrived at all. Radio communications were sporadic. Samsonov believed his centre was winning. His 13th Corps had pushed forward and captured the town of Allenstein against light resistance. He interpreted this as proof the Germans were retreating and ordered the 13th Corps to continue advancing, wheeling southwest to break through what he believed was a weak German defensive line at Tannenberg. This decision sealed the Second Army's fate. By pulling his successful central units forward and changing their direction of advance, Samsonov created a salient that pushed even deeper into the developing German encirclement. His army's formation now resembled an elongated teardrop, with the narrow end pointing northwest and the flanks exposed and crumbling. The Germans couldn't have asked for a better target. Francois continued pushing eastward behind Samsonov's shattered left flank. Mackensen wheeled southwest, driving around the broken right flank. The 2 German corps were racing to link up in Samsonov's rear, and nothing stood in their way. Russian commanders on the flank sent desperate messages to Samsonov, but he either didn't receive them or didn't understand their urgency. By the evening of August 28th, Samsonov finally began to grasp the reality of his situation. Fragmentary reports from the flank suggested catastrophe. The First Corps on his left had disintegrated. The 6th Corps on his right had been shattered. German forces were reported in his rear near the town of Willenberg, which should have been safely behind Russian lines. Samsonov ordered a general retreat on the evening of August 28th, but the order came too late and couldn't be effectively communicated to all units. The Russian Second Army, which had numbered over 150,000 men 5 days earlier, was now scattered across miles of East Prussian forest and farmland, units isolated from each other, communications severed, supply lines cut, and German forces closing in from every direction. On August 29th, Francois's cavalry reached Willenberg and linked up with Mackensen's forces. The encirclement was complete. The Russian Second Army was trapped in a pocket roughly 15 miles across, centred on the village of Froganow. German artillery, carefully positioned on the high ground surrounding the pocket, began a systematic bombardment. Russian units attempting to break out found German infantry blocking every road, every path, every potential escape route. The slaughter was methodical and terrible. Russian soldiers, many of them already exhausted and starving, charged across open fields toward German positions and were mown down by machine gun fire. Some units, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, surrendered en masse. Long columns of Russian prisoners clogged the roads leading out of the pocket, so many that German units couldn't process them all. Samsonov, accompanied by a small group of staff officers, attempted to retreat on foot through the forests south of the pocket. He was 54 years old, overweight, asthmatic, and physically exhausted from days of stress and little sleep. More crushing than physical fatigue was the psychological weight of what had happened. His army had been destroyed, over 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. One of Russia's premier field armies had ceased to exist in less than a week, and he was responsible. On the night of August 29th, moving through dark forests, Samsonov fell behind his staff. When they called out for him, there was no answer. They searched but couldn't find him in the darkness. A single gunshot echoed through the trees. They found Samsonov's body the next morning, a bullet wound in his head and his service revolver in his hand. He had chosen death over the humiliation of reporting his defeat to Tsar Nicholas. His body was buried by German soldiers who found it several days later, treated with military honours despite being an enemy. In 1916, through the International Red Cross, the Germans returned Samsonov's remains to his widow. The final surrender came on August 30th. Isolated pockets of Russian resistance collapsed one after another. German forces swept through the Tannenberg pocket, rounding up prisoners by the tens of thousands. The final tally was almost incomprehensible. The Russian Second Army had lost over 30,000 killed, more than 90,000 captured, and virtually all of its artillery and equipment over 500 guns. Only about 10,000 men from the original army escaped back to Russian territory, mostly from units on the extreme flanks that had never been fully engaged. The German Eighth Army, in contrast, had suffered approximately 15,000 casualties, killed and wounded. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history, a battle of annihilation that completely destroyed an enemy army while suffering minimal losses. Hindenburg, recognizing the propaganda value, requested that the battle be named Tannenberg, even though the fighting had actually occurred near Allenstein, miles away. The name was symbolic, a deliberate reference to the village where in 1410 the Teutonic Knights had been defeated by Polish and Lithuanian forces. Hindenburg framed the victory as revenge for that medieval defeat, as proof of German superiority over Slavic peoples, as a sign that Germany was fighting a righteous defensive war against barbaric invaders. The German propaganda machine went into overdrive. Hindenburg became an instant national hero, his image plastered on posters, postcards and medals. Wooden statues of Hindenburg were erected in cities across Germany, where citizens could hammer in nails after making donations to the war effort. Ludendorff too was celebrated, though he would always stand somewhat in Hindenburg's shadow. Hoffmann, whose plan had made victory possible, was largely ignored by the press, a slight that would rankle him for years. For Russia, Tannenberg was a catastrophe that extended far beyond the military sphere. News of the disaster shattered Russian morale. The army that was supposed to crush Germany in weeks had itself been crushed. The myth of the Russian steamroller, that inexhaustible mass of manpower that would inevitably overwhelm Germany through sheer numbers, had been exposed as a fantasy. Worse, the defeat revealed fundamental problems in Russian military organization. Poor leadership, terrible logistics, primitive communications, and units trained and equipped to 19th century standards facing a 20th century enemy. These problems would plague the Russian army throughout the war. But Tannenberg's strategic significance was more ambiguous than either side initially realized. The German victory did not end the Russian threat to East Prussia. Rennenkampf's First Army, untouched by the disaster, still occupied northeastern East Prussia. The Germans would have to fight a second major battle, the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, to drive Rennenkampf out, and even that wouldn't be the end of Russian incursions into German territory. More significantly, Tannenberg may have cost Germany the war. When the Russian invasion began, the German High Command had panicked and diverted reinforcements from the Western Front to East Prussia. 2 corps, an entire army's worth of troops, were pulled from the critical right wing of the German advance through Belgium and France. These reinforcements didn't arrive in time to affect the battle at Tannenberg, but their absence from the west was felt keenly. In early September, at the First Battle of the Marne, French and British forces stopped the German advance just short of Paris. The Germans came within miles of victory, and many historians have argued that those 2 missing corps, approximately 40,000 men, could have made the difference between victory and defeat. If Tannenberg was the battle Germany won but that cost them the war, it represents one of history's great ironies. For the soldiers who fought there, the battle was an experience that would haunt them forever. Russian survivors spoke of the confusion, the terror of being surrounded, the helplessness of watching German artillery tear apart units that couldn't retreat and couldn't advance. German soldiers described the almost surreal experience of processing prisoners who outnumbered their captors, of marching through forests littered with abandoned Russian equipment, of the eerie silence that fell over the battlefield after the final surrenders. The civilians of East Prussia, caught in the middle, had their own stories, tales of Russian occupation, of Cossacks looting villages, of German refugees fleeing westward only to return weeks later to find their homes destroyed. The human cost of Tannenberg extended far beyond military casualties. Hundreds of villages burned, tens of thousands of civilians displaced, farmland trampled and crops destroyed in the height of harvest season. East Prussia would carry the scars of August 1914 for generations. The battle also revealed the changing nature of warfare. This was not the guerre de mouvement of popular imagination, with cavalry charges and glorious infantry assaults. Tannenberg was won through logistics, rail transport, signals intelligence, and artillery. The Germans had used their superior rail network to redeploy entire corps in days. They had intercepted enemy communications to gain perfect intelligence about Russian intentions. They had positioned artillery to create killing zones where Russian infantry was slaughtered at standoff distances. And they had demonstrated that in modern warfare, encirclement and annihilation were still possible if you could exploit enemy mistakes ruthlessly. The lessons of Tannenberg would be studied by military academies worldwide. The importance of secure communications, the vulnerability of armies that outran their logistics, the value of interior, lines and rail transport, the deadly effectiveness of coordinated artillery, and the catastrophic consequences of command failure. Every major power would analyze the battle and attempt to learn from it, though whether those lessons were properly applied is debatable. In the years after the war, Tannenberg took on mythological proportions in Germany. A massive memorial was constructed at the battlefield, a brooding neo-medieval fortress that served as a pilgrimage site for German nationalists. Hindenburg himself was eventually buried there, his tomb at the centre of the memorial. The battle became a cornerstone of the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth that claimed Germany had not been defeated militarily but betrayed by politicians and socialists at home. Look at Tannenberg, the nationalist argued. Look at what the German army could achieve when properly led and supported. If we could destroy an entire Russian army in 4 days, how could we have lost the war? The answer, they insisted, was betrayal. This mythology would poison Weimar Germany and contribute to the rise of National Socialism. In 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into East Prussia, retreating German troops dynamited the Tannenberg Memorial to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. The destruction was symbolic, the final erasure of a victory that had meant everything and nothing, a triumph that had saved East Prussia temporarily but couldn't save Germany from ultimate defeat. For Russia, Tannenberg became a symbol of the incompetence and corruption of the Tsarist regime. How could an army of 150,000 men simply vanish in 4 days? The disaster fed growing dissatisfaction with the war and with the government. Russian soldiers began to question why they were dying in a war that seemed to benefit no one. The intelligentsia used Tannenberg as proof that the old order was bankrupt, that Russia needed revolutionary change. In this sense, the road from Tannenberg to the Russian Revolution of 1917 was more direct than it might appear. The battle revealed that the Russian Empire was fundamentally incapable of waging modern war, and that revelation had consequences that extended far beyond the Eastern Front. Alexander Solzhenitsyn would later make Tannenberg the centerpiece of his novel August 1914, a sprawling meditation on Russian failure and the collapse of the old order. For Solzhenitsyn, Tannenberg was not just a military defeat, but a moral one, proof that Russia's leaders had betrayed their people through incompetence and indifference. The men who orchestrated the victory went on to shape the remainder of the war. Hindenburg and Ludendorff formed a partnership that would dominate German strategy. In 1916, they were promoted to command of the entire German war effort, essentially establishing a military dictatorship. Hindenburg became chief of the general staff while Ludendorff served as first quartermaster general, but everyone knew Ludendorff was the driving force behind strategic decisions. Together, they would oversee Germany's final offensives in 1918, gambles that came close to winning the war but ultimately failed. After Germany's defeat, Hindenburg would serve as president of the Weimar Republic, using his immense prestige to hold the fragile democracy together, at least temporarily. In 1933, he would appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for Germany and the world. Ludendorff, meanwhile, would drift into right-wing extremism, participating in Hitler's beer hall putsch in 1923 and becoming increasingly involved in radical nationalist politics. Hoffmann, the real architect of Tannenberg, would spend the rest of the war on the Eastern Front, eventually representing Germany at the peace negotiations with Soviet Russia that produced the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He would die in 1927, his contributions to German victory largely forgotten by a public that preferred to worship Hindenburg. The Russian commanders faced grimmer fates. Samsonov was dead, buried twice, first by Germans and then by his own family. Rennenkampf would survive the war only to face a firing squad during the Russian Civil War, executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. The commander of the Russian Northwest Front, General Yakov Jelinsky, who had failed to coordinate the two armies or provide them with adequate support, was dismissed and spent the remainder of the war in obscurity. The ordinary soldiers who survived Tannenberg, both Russian and German, would face 3 more years of brutal warfare. Many who escaped the pocket at Tannenberg would die later on other battlefields, at Verdun, the Somme, or during the Brusilov offensive. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914 would grind on until November 1918, consuming an entire generation of young men. In the end, Tannenberg was a battle that revealed fundamental truths about the First World War and modern warfare generally. It demonstrated that technology, logistics, and intelligence were more important than raw numbers or individual courage. It showed that modern battles could still produce decisive results if commanders exploited enemy mistakes ruthlessly. And it proved that even spectacular tactical victories didn't necessarily translate to strategic success. Germany won at Tannenberg and went on to lose the war. Russia lost at Tannenberg and continued fighting for 3 more years. The battle's true significance lay not in its immediate military consequences, but in its psychological and political impact. For Germany, it provided false hope, the belief that superior leadership and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. For Russia, it accelerated the internal collapse that would culminate in revolution. For the world, it demonstrated that the First World War would be longer, bloodier, and more terrible than anyone had imagined. Today, the battlefield at Tannenberg is quiet farmland and forest, mostly in Poland after borders were redrawn following the Second World War. A few monuments remain, including a small obelisk marking the spot where Samsonov committed suicide. Tourists occasionally visit, trying to imagine the chaos and terror of those August days in 1914. But for the most part, Tannenberg has faded from popular memory, overshadowed by later battles, later wars, later catastrophes. Only military historians and the descendants of those who fought there remember. And yet, in that obscure corner of what was once East Prussia, in those forests and fields where an entire army vanished in 4 days, something important was decided. Not the outcome of the war that would take 4 more years to determine, but the understanding that this war would be different, that the old certainties no longer applied, that death had industrialized and could consume armies with mechanical efficiency. On August 30th, 1914, when the last Russian units surrendered at Tannenberg, the world crossed a threshold. The 19th century finally ended, and the modern age of total war began. The price of that lesson was paid in Russian blood, spilled across the forests of East Prussia, and in the shattered mind of one general who walked into those forests and chose death over dishonor. Alexander Samsonov, commander of the Russian Second Army, was the first but would not be the last to discover that in modern warfare, defeat didn't just mean losing a battle, it meant the annihilation of everything you commanded, everything you believed in, everything you were. His grave stands as a monument not just to one man's tragedy, but to the tragedy of an entire generation that marched into the furnace of the First World War believing in glory and honour, and came out, if they came out at all, understanding only horror and loss. That is the legacy of Tannenberg, the battle that crushed an entire Russian army, and with it, crushed the illusions of an age. The immediate aftermath of Tannenberg sent tremors through every capital in Europe. In St. Petersburg, now renamed Petrograd in a fit of anti-German sentiment, the Russian court received the news with a mixture of disbelief and horror. Tsar Nicholas II, who had taken personal interest in the campaign, was devastated. The loss of an entire army within days of the war's beginning was unprecedented in Russian military history. Court officials scrambled to manage the public relations disaster, suppressing newspapers, censoring casualty lists and preventing the families of the missing from organising or demanding information. The official line was that the Second Army had conducted a fighting withdrawal in good order, a transparent lie that fooled no one. Within weeks, letters began arriving from German prison camps, and the truth could no longer be contained. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were being held in Germany. Entire divisions had simply vanished. The families of the missing flooded military offices with demands for information, creating a bureaucratic nightmare that the Tsarist government was ill-equipped to handle. The political consequences within Russia were immediate and severe. The liberal opposition in the Duma used Tannenberg as evidence that the autocratic system was fundamentally incompetent. How could modern Russia, with its millions of soldiers and vast resources, lose so catastrophically to a numerically inferior German force? The answer, they argued, was that the system itself was rotten. Incompetent generals appointed through nepotism rather than merit, corrupt officials more concerned with personal enrichment than military efficiency, and a high command that had learned nothing from the disasters of the Russo-Japanese War a decade earlier. The Conservatives, meanwhile, blamed treachery and sabotage. Someone must have betrayed the army's plans to the Germans. How else could the Germans have positioned their forces so perfectly? Conspiracy theories flourished. German spies were supposedly everywhere, in the war ministry, in the general staff, even in the imperial court itself. The Empress Alexandra, German-born, came under particular suspicion, whispers that would grow louder as the war progressed and eventually contribute to the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. In France and Britain, Tannenberg was viewed with alarm but also with a certain grim satisfaction. The Russian defeat validated Allied suspicions that the Eastern Front would be a secondary theatre, that Germany's main strength lay in the West, and that victory would ultimately be decided in France. French military planners had always been sceptical of Russian capabilities, and Tannenberg confirmed their worst fears. But the battle also bought France precious time. While Hindenburg and Ludendorff were destroying Samsonov's army in East Prussia, the German right wing in France was faltering. The crucial Battle of the Marne, fought from September 5th to 12th, stopped the German advance and saved Paris. French commanders privately acknowledged that the Russian offensive, despite its catastrophic failure, had served its purpose by forcing Germany to divert resources and attention eastward at a critical moment. The Russians had sacrificed an army to save France, though whether this had been intentional strategy or unintended consequence remained debatable. The German celebration of Tannenberg, while genuine, was also carefully orchestrated propaganda. The victory served multiple purposes for the German high command and political leadership. Domestically, it provided a much-needed morale boost after the disappointing news from the Marne. Germans could tell themselves that their armies were invincible, that the setback in France was merely temporary, and that ultimate victory was assured. The Kaiser personally decorated Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and both men were promoted. Hindenburg, in particular, became the face of German military virtue. His stern, grandfatherly image, complete with distinctive moustache and Pickelhaube helmet, appeared everywhere. Internationally, Tannenberg was used to intimidate neutral nations and reassure anxious allies. Look what Germany could do when pressed, the message ran. Any nation foolish enough to join the Entente against Germany would face similar destruction. But beneath the triumphalism, German military leaders understood that Tannenberg had solved nothing strategically. East Prussia had been saved. Yes, but Russia remained in the war with millions of additional soldiers still mobilizing. The Russian defeats at Tannenberg and the subsequent Masurian Lakes battles had been tactical disasters but strategic inconveniences. Russia's vast manpower reserves and enormous territory meant it could absorb losses that would have knocked any other nation out of the war. German planners began to realize they faced a nightmarish scenario, a two-front war with no prospect of quick victory on either front. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. Germany was now committed to a prolonged struggle against enemies with greater combined resources, larger populations, and the ability to outlast Germany in a war of attrition. Tannenberg had won a battle but made the war unwinnable. The treatment of Russian prisoners taken at Tannenberg revealed much about the nature of this conflict. The 90,000 captured Russian soldiers represented the largest mass surrender in military history to that date. German logistics were strained to the breaking point trying to process, house, and feed this enormous influx of prisoners. Initial treatment was relatively humane by the standards of the time. The Germans recognized that these prisoners represented valuable propaganda material and potential labor. Photographs of long columns of dejected Russian soldiers were distributed worldwide as proof of German superiority. The prisoners were sorted by nationality, with ethnic Germans and Austro-Hungarian subjects separated for potential recruitment. Poles were offered the possibility of fighting against Russia in exchange for the promise of an independent Poland under German protection. The remaining prisoners, mostly ethnic Russians, were dispersed to camps throughout Germany and used as agricultural and industrial labor. Conditions in these camps deteriorated rapidly as the war progressed, and Germany itself began to suffer shortages. By 1916, Russian prisoners were dying in large numbers from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The Geneva Convention regulations regarding prisoner treatment were honoured more in the breach than the observance. Russian complaints to neutral observers were dismissed by German authorities, who pointed out that German prisoners in Russia faced similar or worse conditions. The Tannenberg prisoners became pawns in a larger game of international diplomacy and propaganda, their suffering weaponized by both sides to justify further escalation and brutality. After the Russian Revolution, many of these prisoners would face an agonizing choice between remaining in German captivity or returning to a homeland consumed by civil war. Some never made it home, dying in camps or during the chaotic repatriation process. Their families, many of whom had never received official notification of their capture, would spend years seeking information about their fate. The battlefield itself became a contested space of memory and meaning, even before the war ended. German authorities quickly recognized Tannenberg's propaganda value and began planning memorials while fighting still raged elsewhere. The first monuments were simple affairs, wooden crosses marking mass graves where Russian dead had been hastily buried. German military graves were more elaborate, individual headstones with names and units carefully recorded. This distinction was deliberate. German dead were heroes to be remembered individually. Russian dead were an anonymous mass, evidence of German superiority rather than fellow soldiers worthy of respect. Local East Prussian civilians, many of whom had fled during the Russian invasion and returned to find their homes destroyed, had complex feelings about the battle. Yes, the Germans had driven out the Russians, but the destruction had been immense. Entire villages had been burned, crops destroyed, livestock killed or stolen. The civilian casualties, while modest compared to the military losses, were still significant. German propaganda portrayed East Prussian civilians as victims of Russian barbarism, but the reality was more nuanced. Both armies had requisitioned supplies, impressed labour, and treated civilians as obstacles or resources rather than people with rights. The evolution of the Tannenberg Memorial itself reflected changing German attitudes and the growing militarization of German society. The initial proposal was for a modest monument, but as Hindenburg's stature grew, so did the ambitions for the memorial. By 1924, 10 years after the battle, construction began on a massive complex designed by architects Walter and Johannes Krüger. The design deliberately evoked the castles of the Teutonic Knights, linking modern German military achievement with medieval crusading glory. 8 towers, each representing a German province, surrounded a central courtyard where Hindenburg himself would eventually be entombed. The memorial wasn't just commemorating a battle, but constructing a mythology about German military invincibility and racial superiority. The message was clear. Germany had defeated the Slavic hordes in 1410, lost temporarily, but had redeemed that loss in 1914. The implication was that Germany's defeat in 1918 was another temporary setback that would eventually be avenged. The memorial's dedication ceremony in 1927 was a massive nationalist spectacle. Over 100,000 people attended, including President Hindenburg himself, now in his 80s, but still the living embodiment of German military tradition. Veterans of the battle, wearing their old uniforms and medals, marched in formation. Speeches emphasized sacrifice, honor, and the stab-in-the-back myth that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated. The Weimar Republic's civilian government was conspicuously underrepresented. This was a military celebration, a reminder that despite the Republic's formal authority, the old Prussian military caste still commanded deep loyalty. Hitler, then still consolidating power, attended and studied the proceedings carefully. He understood instinctively what the memorial represented, a focal point for nationalist sentiment that could be harnessed for his own purposes. When he took power in 1933, the Tannenberg Memorial became a pilgrimage site for the Nazi movement, hosting massive rallies and ceremonies that linked Nazi ideology with Prussian military tradition. The strategic lessons of Tannenberg were studied obsessively by military theorists worldwide throughout the interwar period. German officers, particularly those in the Reichswehr and later the Wehrmacht, analysed the battle as a template for future operations. The concept of Kesselschlacht, the Battle of Encirclement, became central to German military doctrine. Tannenberg demonstrated that it was still possible to achieve decisive victory through manoeuvre, that modern armies could be trapped and destroyed despite their size. When German forces executed the encirclement of French and British armies at Dunkirk in 1940, the blitzkrieg tactics that swept through Poland and France, and the massive encirclements on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa, they were applying lessons learned at Tannenberg on a vastly larger scale. The double envelopment of Soviet forces at Kiev in 1941, which netted over 600,000 prisoners, was Tannenberg multiplied sevenfold. German officers explicitly referenced Tannenberg when planning these operations, seeing themselves as heirs to Hindenburg and Ludendorff's legacy. But the Russians also learned from Tannenberg, though the lessons were painful and came at enormous cost. Soviet military theorists studying the battle identified the key failures of command and control, inadequate communications, poor coordination between armies, logistical weakness, and commanders operating in isolation without understanding the larger situation. These lessons informed Soviet military doctrine throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The emphasis on radio communications, mechanized forces that could maneuver rapidly, and centralized command structures all stemmed partly from the desire to ensure that another Tannenberg could never happen. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the initial disasters, the encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk and Kiev, seemed to suggest that Russia had learned nothing. But unlike Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union had the industrial capacity and ruthless determination to absorb these catastrophic losses and continue fighting. The Germans would eventually discover, to their horror, that defeating Russia required more than brilliant tactical victories. It required destroying the Soviet Union's will to resist, and that proved impossible. The human stories of Tannenberg survivors revealed the battle's long-term psychological impact. Russian soldiers who escaped the encirclement or survived German captivity returned home changed men. Many suffered what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, plagued by nightmares, unable to readjust to civilian life, prone to alcoholism and violence. Their accounts of the battle, when they could be persuaded to speak at all, were fragmentary and confused. The overwhelming chaos of the encirclement, the terror of German artillery bombardment, the helplessness of watching their units disintegrate, and the shame of surrender had shattered their sense of themselves as soldiers and men. Some turned to revolutionary politics, concluding that a system which could produce such catastrophe deserved to be destroyed. When the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, Tannenberg veterans were disproportionately represented among the Bolshevik supporters in the army. They had seen Tsarist incompetence firsthand and wanted no part of the old order. German veterans had their own demons. While the battle had been a victory, the experience of industrial warfare, the mechanical slaughter of thousands of men, the processing of masses of prisoners, and the realization that this was only the beginning of a much longer conflict had been traumatizing in its own way. Junior officers who had led charges at Tannenberg would spend the next 4 years in the trenches of the Western Front, watching their men die in futile offensives that gained nothing. Some of these officers would later join the Freikorps, the paramilitary organizations that terrorized Weimar Germany in the early 1920s. Others would form the core of the Wehrmacht officer corps in the 1930s. The experience of Tannenberg, the belief that German military genius could overcome any odds, created a dangerous overconfidence that would contribute to Germany's strategic blunders in the Second World War. The technological aspects of Tannenberg deserved deeper examination. While the battle has often been portrayed as a triumph of traditional military virtues, strategy, leadership, and fighting spirit, the reality was that technology played a crucial role. German railways, far superior to Russian equivalents, allowed rapid redeployment of entire corps. This wasn't just about having more trains or better tracks. It was about integrated planning, coordinated schedules, and the ability to move hundreds of thousands of men with their equipment across significant distances in days rather than weeks. The Germans had been planning and practicing these movements for years. Every railway line in East Prussia had been surveyed, every bridge strengthened, every siding catalogued. When the crisis came, they could execute complex movements that would have been impossible for the Russians. Radio interception was another crucial technology. German signals intelligence units had been eavesdropping on Russian communications since the war's opening days. The Russians, incredibly, continued transmitting in the clear even after suffering defeats that should have made them suspicious. This wasn't just laziness or incompetence. Russia lacked the codebooks, the trained cipher clerks, and the secure communication systems that modern warfare required. The Russian army in 1914 was essentially fighting with 19th century communication systems against an enemy that had embraced 20th century technology. The results were predictable. Every Russian movement, every order, every plan was known to German intelligence, often before Russian field commanders received their instructions. This intelligence advantage allowed the Germans to position forces with perfect confidence, knowing exactly where Russian units would be and when they would arrive. Artillery technology also played a crucial role, though this is often overlooked in favour of romantic narratives about infantry heroism. German artillery at Tannenberg was more accurate, better supplied, and more effectively coordinated than Russian equivalents. German guns had superior optics, better fire control systems, and well-trained crews who had practiced coordinated barrages. Russian artillery, while numerous, suffered from ammunition shortages, poor communication with infantry, and crews that lacked adequate training. When German artillery opened fire, it could deliver devastating barrages that shattered Russian formations before German infantry even advanced. Russian artillery responses were sporadic, poorly aimed, and often ineffective. This imbalance in artillery effectiveness multiplied German advantages and made Russian attempts at counterattack suicidal. The medical aspects of Tannenberg revealed the brutal reality of industrial warfare. Wounded soldiers on both sides faced appalling conditions. German medical services, while better organised than Russian equivalents, were still overwhelmed by the scale of casualties. Field hospitals quickly filled beyond capacity. Surgeons worked in makeshift facilities, often without adequate supplies or anaesthetics. The wounded who couldn't be evacuated immediately lay in the open, in forests or fields, sometimes for days. Many died from shock, blood loss, or infection before receiving treatment. Russian wounded faced even worse conditions. As the encirclement tightened, Russian medical personnel were cut off from supplies. Wounded men were left behind as units retreated, and many were simply abandoned when the final surrender came. German medical units treating captured Russian wounded were shocked by the condition of these men, not just from battle injuries but from malnutrition, disease and neglect that predated the fighting. The environmental impact of Tannenberg, rarely discussed in military histories, was significant. The battle was fought during late summer, harvest season for East Prussian farmers. Armies trampling through fields destroyed crops that communities depended on for winter survival. Artillery bombardment cratered farmland, making it unusable for years. Forests were burned, either deliberately as armies retreated or accidentally from artillery fire. The thousands of dead horses, over 10,000 Russian horses, were killed or captured, created public health hazards as carcasses decomposed in late summer heat. Local water supplies were contaminated by bodies, human and animal, and by the detritus of warfare, spent shells, discarded equipment, and chemical residues. East Prussian communities would spend years recovering from the environmental devastation of those few August days. The cultural impact of Tannenberg extended far beyond Germany and Russia. The battle became a reference point in discussions about military strategy, national character, and the nature of modern warfare. In Britain and France, Tannenberg was cited as evidence that the war would be won through superior organisation and industrial capacity rather than individual heroism. American military observers studying the battle drew lessons about the importance of logistics, communications, and coordinated operations that would influence American doctrine when the United States entered the war in 1917. In Japan, which had defeated Russia in 1905, Tannenberg was seen as confirmation that Russia remained militarily backward despite modernization efforts. This perception would influence Japanese strategic thinking for decades, and contribute to Japanese decisions to challenge Soviet power in border conflicts during the 1930s. The artistic and literary responses to Tannenberg reflected changing attitudes about war itself. Early German accounts celebrated the battle in traditional heroic terms: brave soldiers, brilliant generals, glorious victory. But as the war dragged on, and the full horror of industrial conflict became undeniable, artistic treatments became more ambiguous. Ernst Junger, in his war memoirs, referenced Tannenberg as the last moment when traditional military virtues seemed to matter, before the Western Front's trench warfare reduced soldiers to anonymous victims of artillery and machine guns. Erich Maria Remarque, though he focused on Western Front experiences in All Quiet on the Western Front, understood that Tannenberg represented a transition point between old and new warfare. Russian literary responses were darker still. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's August 1914 portrayed Tannenberg as a metaphor for Russian societal collapse, a system so corrupt and incompetent that it couldn't even wage war effectively. The economic consequences of Tannenberg rippled through both German and Russian societies. For Germany, the victory required enormous expenditure of resources, ammunition, transportation, and food for prisoners that the country could barely afford. The diversion of resources to the Eastern Front, even in victory, weakened Germany's position in the West. For Russia, the disaster compounded existing economic problems. The loss of over 100,000 men removed labour from factories and farms. The destruction of equipment meant Russian industry had to replace lost artillery, rifles and supplies, while also equipping new formations. Russian military spending escalated dramatically, funded through borrowing and currency inflation that would eventually contribute to economic collapse and revolution. The families of the dead and missing faced financial ruin, as government pensions were inadequate when they were paid at all. The economic strain of continuing the war after Tannenberg contributed to growing social unrest that the Tsarist government proved unable to manage. The diplomatic impact of Tannenberg influenced neutral nations' calculations about joining the war. Ottoman Empire leaders, watching the battle's outcome, concluded that Germany and Austria-Hungary were stronger than previously believed and entered the war on the Central Powers' side in late October 1914. This decision, influenced partly by Tannenberg's demonstration of German military capability, would have enormous consequences for the Middle East and the post-war world. Italy, nominally allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, drew different conclusions from Tannenberg. Italian leaders recognized that the Eastern Front would consume German resources and attention, creating opportunities for Italy to seize Austrian territory. Italy's eventual decision to join the Entente in 1915 was influenced by the calculation that Germany couldn't dominate both fronts simultaneously, a lesson reinforced by Tannenberg's aftermath. The question of whether Tannenberg could have been avoided or whether Russian defeat was inevitable has occupied military historians for over a century. Some argue that the battle was lost before it began, that Russian logistical weakness, poor communications, inadequate leadership, and the personal animosity between Rennenkampf and Samsonov made disaster inevitable once the invasion began. Others contend that the Russians came close to success, that if Rennenkampf had advanced more aggressively, if Samsonov had been more cautious, if Russian communications had been secure, the outcome could have been different. The truth likely lies between these extremes. Russian defeat was highly probable given the systemic weaknesses of the Russian military system, but it wasn't absolutely certain. German victory required not just Russian mistakes, but German excellence in planning, execution, and exploitation of opportunities. The combination of Russian weakness and German strength proved decisive. The legacy of Tannenberg for the 20th century extended well beyond military history. The battle contributed to mythologies about German military invincibility that would fuel Nazi ideology and contribute to the Second World War. It demonstrated the vulnerability of multinational empires like Russia to modern warfare, foreshadowing the collapse of the Romanov, Habsburg and Ottoman empires. It revealed the human cost of industrial conflict and the inadequacy of traditional military ethics and international law to constrain violence in an age of total war. And it showed that even spectacular tactical victories couldn't guarantee strategic success, a lesson that military leaders repeatedly failed to internalize throughout the 20th century. In the end, Tannenberg was both more and less than it appeared to contemporaries. More than a single battle, it was a revelation of how modern states would wage war, through industrial production, technological superiority, and the ruthless exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Less than a decisive victory, it was one battle in a war that would consume empires and reshape the world. The soldiers who fought there, Russian and German alike, were participants in something larger than they understood. They thought they were fighting for national survival, for honour, for their respective empires. In reality, they were actors in the death throes of an entire civilization, the old European order that had dominated the world for centuries. That order would not survive the First World War. Its death warrant was signed in many places, the Marne, Verdun, the Somme. But Tannenberg was among the first and clearest signs that the old world was dying, and something new, more terrible and more modern, was being born in blood and fire on the battlefields of Europe.